I accidentally left the TV on too loud. My daughter-in-law stormed in and said, "You're too old to live alone. Maybe we should handle things for you." My son nodded quietly. 2 days later, they presented me with a brochure for assisted living. But when she opened the mailbox the next morning and saw the envelope stamped estate transfer, her voice broke as she realized. I've always believed that a quiet life is something you build, not something you stumble into. Mine didn't look like much from the outside. A small, single-story house at the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac in Northern Virginia. White siding, a porch that creaked just enough to remind you it had stories, and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left no matter how many times I tried to straighten it. But it was mine. Every inch of it. I bought that house in 1987 with my late husband, Daniel, back when interest rates were high and we thought we'd never pay it off. We raised our son Michael in that house. I still remember the pencil marks on the inside of the hallway closet where we tracked his height every year. I never painted over them, never could. After Daniel passed, the house got quieter. Not empty, never empty, but quieter. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones. At first it felt unbearable. Then over time it became something else. Control. Every morning I woke up at 6:30, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I made my coffee the same way, 2 scoops, a pinch of cinnamon, no sugar. I sat at the kitchen table facing the backyard, watching the same pair of cardinals that visited the fence like clockwork. Routine is underrated. People think it's boring, but routine is freedom when you've lived long enough to earn it. Michael didn't understand that. He lived about 40 minutes away in a newer development. Cookie-cutter houses, identical lawns, the kind of place where everything looked perfect but felt temporary. He worked in finance, something complicated I never quite followed, and he married a woman named Laura about 8 years ago. Laura was efficient. That's the word I always used when people asked about her. She was organized, articulate, always dressed like she had somewhere more important to be. She smiled often, but it never quite reached her eyes. Still, I tried, I really did. I invited them over for dinner once a week. Nothing fancy, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The same meals Michael grew up on. At first they came regularly. Over time it became once a month, then holidays, then whenever it was convenient. I didn't complain. That's another thing you learn with age. Complaining doesn't bring people closer. It just gives them reasons to stay away longer. So I adapted. I started volunteering at the local library twice a week. Nothing strenuous, just organizing returns, helping children find books, chatting with regulars. It kept my mind active, my body moving. I paid my bills on time, every single one. I balanced my checkbook by hand, even though Michael once insisted I should just use apps. I kept my doctor's appointments, took my medication, maintained the house as best I could. Was I slower than I used to be? Of course. But slower doesn't mean incapable. That's a distinction people forget. The TV incident happened on a Tuesday evening. I remember because Tuesdays were my indulgence nights. I allowed myself to watch old movies, black and white classics, the kind that told stories without needing explosions or special effects. That night I was watching Casablanca. I must have turned the volume up higher than usual. My hearing isn't what it used to be, and the dialogue in those films can be soft. I didn't think much of it. Until the front door burst open. There's no knock. There's no call. Just the sharp, unmistakable sound of someone entering like they owned the place. I turned, startled, the remote slipping slightly in my hand. Laura stood in the doorway, her face tight, eyes scanning the room like she was assessing damage. Michael was behind her, quieter, hesitant, but present. "The TV is blaring," she said, not even greeting me. We could hear it from outside. I blinked, still trying to process the sudden intrusion. "Oh," I said, lowering the volume. I didn't realize it was that loud. She stepped further inside, heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome, counting down something I couldn't yet see. "That's exactly the problem," she replied. Michael shifted behind her, hands in his pockets. "Moms," he added softer, "we've been worried." Worried. It's a curious word, it sounds gentle, caring even. But sometimes it's just a door opener. "For what?" I asked. Laura didn't hesitate. "For this," she said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "For you living here alone like this. It's not safe. It's not appropriate anymore." The word appropriate lingered in the air like something sour. I sat a little straighter in my chair. I've been living here for nearly 40 years, I said calmly. I think I've managed. That was then, she shot back. Things change, you're older now. There it was. Not concern. Assessment. Michael finally stepped forward, his voice careful. She just means, maybe it's time to consider some options. Options. Another soft word. Another door. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The same boy who used to run through this house with scraped knees and mismatched socks. The same boy who once cried because he thought monsters lived under his bed. Now he stood there, nodding along. Quietly agreeing. And in that moment, something subtle shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just awareness. I'm fine, I said evenly. I had the TV up too loud, that's all. Laura exhaled sharply, clearly unconvinced. This isn't just about the TV, she said. It's about the bigger picture. I didn't ask what she meant. Because deep down, I already knew. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. This was the beginning of something. And as they stood there in my living room, uninvited, evaluating, deciding, I realized something else too. They thought I didn't see it coming. They were wrong. They didn't bring it up again that night. Not directly. Laura shifted the conversation with practiced ease, like someone who knew exactly how far to push before pulling back. She asked about my doctor's appointments, my medications, whether I'd considered installing safety features in the house, grab bars, emergency alert systems, things that sounded helpful but felt like labels. Michael stayed mostly quiet. That was new. He used to talk endlessly as a child, about school, about friends, about the future. Now he chose his words carefully, as if every sentence needed approval before it left his mouth. They stayed for about 30 minutes, long enough to make their presence felt, short enough to avoid anything that resembled a real conversation. Before leaving, Laura paused at the door. We'll check in later this week, she said, her tone clipped but polite, just to make sure everything's under control. Under control? I smiled faintly, of course. Michael lingered a second longer. Call me if you need anything, Mom, he added. I nodded, but I didn't say what I was thinking. You didn't wait for me to need anything before showing up tonight. The door closed behind them, and the house returned to its familiar quiet. But it wasn't the same quiet anymore. This one felt watched. 2 days later, they came back. This time they knocked. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I opened the door, and Laura stepped in first again, holding a glossy brochure like it was evidence in a courtroom. Michael followed, carrying nothing but the same uneasy expression. We found something, Laura said, already walking toward the kitchen table. I closed the door slowly behind them. Something, I repeated. She placed the brochure in front of me and flattened it with her palm. An assisted living community, she said. It's actually very nice, top-rated, clean, secure, full-time staff. I didn't touch the brochure right away. Instead, I looked at her. Then at Michael. Then back at the brochure. The cover showed a smiling elderly couple walking through a garden that looked too perfect to be real. 2 days, I said quietly. Laura tilted her head. Excuse me. It took you 2 days, I repeated, to decide I shouldn't live in my own home anymore. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Mom, it's not like that. It's exactly like that, I interrupted, still calm. Laura crossed her arms. This isn't about taking anything away from you, she said. It's about making sure you're safe and cared for. You can't seriously think this, she gestured around the house again, is sustainable. I finally picked up the brochure. The paper was thick, expensive, carefully chosen. Just like her words. They have activities, she continued. Medical supervision, transportation, you wouldn't have to worry about anything. I flipped it open. Pages of staged happiness, bingo nights. Group exercises, smiling staff members with name tags and perfect posture. A life curated for people who were no longer trusted to curate their own. And what happens to this house? I asked, still looking at the pages. There was a pause. A small one. But I noticed. We'd handle it, Laura said. Sell it most likely. The market is strong right now. It's actually a good time. Of course it was. I looked up slowly. We would handle it, I asked. Michael finally spoke up. Mom, it just makes sense. It's a lot for you to manage on your own. The maintenance, the bills. I've managed it for decades, I said. And you've done great, he replied quickly, but things change. There it was again. That phrase, things change. It sounded so reasonable. So inevitable. That's not the only concern, Laura added, her voice lowering slightly, as if she were about to say something particularly important. There's also the financial aspect. I didn't react outwardly. But inside, something sharpened. What about it? I asked. She exchanged a quick glance with Michael before continuing. We've noticed some inconsistencies, she said carefully. Checks, withdrawals, things that could become risky if not properly managed. Inconsistencies. That was new. I balance my accounts every month, I said. Yes, but manually, she replied. That leaves room for error, and at your age, even small errors can have big consequences. Michael nodded. We just want to make sure everything is secure, he said. Protected. Protected. Another soft word. Another door. I closed the brochure. Protected from what? I asked. Laura didn't hesitate. From making decisions that could harm you, she said. There it was. Not concern. Not even assessment anymore. Control. Clear, direct, unapologetic. I leaned back in my chair. And you've decided I'm already making those decisions, I said. It's not a matter of deciding, she replied. It's a matter of recognizing reality. I let that sit for a moment. Then I nodded slowly. I see. Michael leaned forward slightly. We're not trying to force anything, he said. We just want you to consider it. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Do you? I asked. He hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because in that hesitation, I saw it. Not uncertainty. Not doubt. Compliance. He had already agreed. This wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. A step in a plan that had already been outlined, discussed, and quietly approved. And I was the last to be informed. They stayed longer this time. An hour's, maybe more. Laura walked through the house, making subtle observations disguised as helpful suggestions. This rug could be a tripping hazard. These stairs might be difficult later on. You should really think about simplifying things. Simplifying. That word echoed louder than the others. Because what she meant wasn't the house. It was me. Michael followed her, occasionally adding something supportive, but rarely initiating. By the time they left, the brochure was still on the table. They didn't ask me to decide right away. They didn't need to. They believed the decision was already made. All they had to do was wait for me to catch up. That night, I didn't watch any movies. I sat at the kitchen table, the brochure in front of me, untouched since they'd left. The house was quiet again. But this time it felt different. Not watched. Measured. Evaluated. Like I was already being phased out of my own life. I reached for the drawer beside me and pulled out my checkbook. Then my bank statements. Then a small folder I kept tucked away in the back, documents most people wouldn't think twice about. Deeds. Accounts. Signatures. I opened it slowly, flipping through each page with deliberate care. Everything was exactly where it should be. Organized. Precise. Intentional. Just like I'd always kept it. And as I sat there, reviewing the life I had built piece by piece, a quiet realization settled in. They thought this was about decline, about age, about capability. But it was. This was about access, about control, about positioning themselves just close enough to take over when the moment came. They just needed a reason, a justification, something small enough to sound harmless, like a TV left on too loud. I closed the folder gently. Then I smiled, not because I found any of this amusing, but because, for the first time since they walked through that door, I understood something clearly. They weren't preparing me for the next stage of my life. They were preparing to take it from me. And they believed I wouldn't notice. They were wrong. The next morning I woke before dawn, as I always did. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee grounds, and a thin strip of sunlight had begun sneaking through the blinds. My routine remained untouched. That morning, however, felt different. A subtle tension under my skin, a quiet awareness that the world had shifted while I slept. I didn't need to call Michael or Laura. I already knew where they would be. The brochure was on the table, and I imagined them whispering in their car, plotting logistics like generals mapping a battlefield. The thought made my stomach tighten, but it also ignited a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I would not be rushed, I would not be cornered. By mid-morning, I took my usual walk through the neighborhood, careful to stay visible but unassuming. I noticed a few familiar faces nodding politely, offering smiles that seemed faintly brighter than usual. There's something about community rhythm, neighbors, pets, passing traffic, that reinforces independence. I breathed it in. They didn't need to know that I was already planning, observing, and recalibrating. That evening, Laura called. Her tone was sweet, almost saccharine, but underneath it, I recognized the sharp edges she tried so carefully to hide. "Just checking if you've thought about the brochure," she said. "I have," I replied calmly, setting my coffee mug down. "I've thought about it very carefully." "Great," she said. "I'm sure you'll see it makes sense. We're just trying to help." Her phrasing was deliberate, subtle, but there was no room for misunderstanding. We were in charge, you were being advised. I didn't give her the satisfaction of an emotional response. "I appreciate it," I said evenly, "but I'll decide in my own time." Silence hung on the line for a beat longer than expected, then she chuckled lightly. "Of course, Mom, of course, take your time." When the call ended, I let my fingers linger over the kitchen counter. A plan began to take shape, slow and deliberate like a tide carving stone. They had underestimated me. They believed age brought fragility, that a few persuasive words and a shiny brochure could bend my will. They had misjudged me entirely. 2 days later, the fallout began, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Michael came by under the guise of checking in, and Laura followed, armed with another copy of the brochure, this one annotated with notes about room layouts, social programs, and healthcare services. "You really should consider this," Laura insisted, sliding the folder across the table. "I have," I said quietly, "and I've decided I need more information." Michael frowned. "More information?" "Yes," I replied, "about the financial and legal details, transfers, titles, liabilities, all of it." Her confident posture faltered slightly, just enough to see her teeth grit behind that practiced smile. "You can't just decide to ignore our advice," she said, leaning closer. "I'm not ignoring anything," I said evenly. "I'm simply gathering facts before I make a decision that affects my life." And that's when the first cracks appeared. Laura's eyes flicked toward Michael, seeking confirmation, but he didn't answer immediately. His posture stiffened, and I saw the tension in his jaw, the same tension I'd noticed the first day they showed up, the tension of someone realizing they might have overstepped. The room felt smaller suddenly, compressed by unspoken calculations. I didn't speak again for a long time. I let them stew in the discomfort of my silence. That night I went to my study and pulled out the old filing cabinet, 3 drawers, meticulously organized. The top drawer contained household bills, the middle one held insurance policies and medical records, and the bottom one was the one they hadn't seen. It was a folder labeled estate transfer and legal instruments. I hadn't touched it in over a decade, not since Daniel passed, not since Michael had graduated college. Inside were all the documents that defined ownership of the house, the accounts, the life insurance, and the trust Daniel and I had set up long ago. I had left it untouched intentionally, knowing that someday, if anyone tried to manipulate the situation, it would all come into play. I made a copy of each document, photographs, digital scans, and even a small legally certified copy sent to my attorney, who was now quietly aware of the situation. I didn't plan to move immediately. This wasn't about impulsive action. This was about positioning myself, about letting the tension build naturally, about letting them believe they were in control while I quietly prepared the revelation that would make them realize just how wrong they had been. By the end of the week, subtle shifts began to occur. Laura started dropping comments during casual visits about how quickly things are moving and how challenging it can be to manage your own affairs at your age. Michael, hesitant at first, began echoing her points in softer tones, trying to manipulate compliance without overt confrontation. And yet, the more they pressed, the more fragile their veneer of control became. Their insistence revealed their underlying assumption that age equals weakness, that authority and life experience could be brushed aside with brochures, recommendations, and condescending concern. They didn't notice the smile I hid when they turned the brochure over, not realizing I already knew the weight of my own legal leverage. Not noticing that while they assumed vulnerability, I was fully aware of every loophole, every clause, every title, and every account. They were the aggressors, but in their aggression, they underestimated one immutable fact. I had nothing to lose and everything to protect. By the end of that week, I had set the stage. They believed the plan was theirs to execute. They believed the battle had already been won. They believed I was the passive, compliant elderly woman they had so carefully underestimated. They were wrong. And when the mailbox revealed its secret 2 days later, everything would change. The morning was crisp, colder than usual for early spring in Northern Virginia, with a wind that rattled the bare branches outside my window. I brewed my coffee as usual, the aroma filling the kitchen and masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. But today I wasn't just sipping coffee. I was preparing for the first real act in a plan I'd been quietly formulating since Laura and Michael had first intruded into my life. You see, the mind of a seasoned strategist doesn't reveal itself all at once. It evolves in layers, quietly accumulating facts, observing behavior, and cataloging weaknesses. Over decades, I had honed patience into an art. Every seemingly insignificant detail, the TV incident, Laura's clipped tones, Michael's hesitation, was a brushstroke in the portrait of opportunity. And now that portrait was complete. I started by revisiting the documents I had meticulously organized the night before. Titles, deeds, trust agreements, bank account statements, insurance policies. All of it was solid, watertight, and precisely what I needed to turn the tables without the slightest hint of illegality. Every line, every clause, every signature was a tool in my hands. The awakening wasn't just about realizing they were trying to manipulate me. It was about realizing I had every means to ensure their overreach would backfire spectacularly. Next, I began observing their patterns. Laura had a tendency to overprepare, overplan, and overstep, believing that meticulous documentation equated to authority. Michael, ever the loyal son, followed her lead but hesitated at the edges, revealing cracks in their joint strategy. Every weeknight, I listened carefully to their subtle cues. The way Laura adjusted her tone when speaking to neighbors, the way Michael carried himself when negotiating small household matters over the phone. These were not random behaviors. They were the scaffolding upon which I would build my countermeasure. The awakening also meant understanding the psychology of entitlement. Laura and Michael both believed they had the moral high ground. They thought their concern justified their intrusion. That arrogance, that assumption of superiority, became the weapon I would wield. I didn't confront them yet. I didn't need to. I simply let them operate under the illusion that they controlled the narrative. I became invisible in their story while silently authoring my own. I also began crafting my outward persona carefully. I needed to appear compliant without surrendering any actual authority. I answered Laura's calls politely, always with measured words. I nodded during conversations, always allowing them to believe their suggestions were considered, even when I had no intention of acting on them. I allowed subtle errors in my own responses to bait them, leading them to underestimate my grasp of the situation. Every smile, every agreement, every gentle concession was a calculated step to make them feel secure. And then there was the mailbox. That small, leaning metal receptacle at the curb, seemingly trivial, would soon play a pivotal role. I had arranged for certified copies of the estate documents to be processed quietly, legally, and without fanfare. A notification of estate transfer had been prepared for delivery, not for immediate legal effect, but as a psychological trigger. The anticipation of that moment became central to my strategy. During these days of quiet planning, I also strengthened my connections. I called my attorney regularly, ensuring they were briefed and prepared for any reaction from Laura and Michael. I contacted the local bank to confirm the status of accounts and the proper procedures for estate transfers. I even reached out to a trusted neighbor who would witness certain interactions if necessary. Every move was deliberate, calculated, and prepared for multiple contingencies. Emotionally, I was more composed than I had been in years. The fear they tried to instill, fear of isolation, fear of losing autonomy, was replaced by focus. The more they pushed, the clearer my own path became. I started to see the brilliance of patience in action. By allowing them to make their moves first, I forced them into positions where their assumptions about my weakness could be exploited. And the most crucial element of awakening, I embraced my own power. Age, independence, and the home I had built were not liabilities, they were leverage. I realized that what Laura and Michael wanted was not care or safety, but control. And control, when misapplied, is a fragile thing, easily undone by strategy, timing, and psychological insight. By the end of the week, I was ready. The plan was no longer just theoretical, it was operational. I knew the exact moment I would activate it, the precise way it would unfold, and the inevitable reaction it would provoke. I had positioned myself not as the victim of their arrogance, but as the architect of their inevitable reckoning. The awakening wasn't just about defending what was mine. It was about asserting that I still commanded the narrative, that I could manipulate circumstance as deftly as they believed they could, that the illusion of control they so confidently wore like armor was about to shatter. And when the envelope finally appeared in the mailbox, stamped boldly with the words estate transfer, I would watch them realize, not just intellectually, but viscerally, that their miscalculation had sealed their own fate. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself a faint, satisfied smile. Because I wasn't just going to defend my independence. I was about to deliver a lesson in patience, precision, and poetic justice. The mailbox was quiet that morning, as it usually was. I watched from the kitchen window while sipping coffee, the golden liquid warming my hands and steadying my mind. The envelope, carefully prepared, stamped estate transfer, was inside. Its arrival was unremarkable to anyone else, but for me it was the spark. Today, everything would begin. I let the morning unfold naturally. I answered calls from Laura and Michael with casual politeness, giving nothing away. "Yes, I'm reviewing the documents," I said when Laura asked. "No, I haven't decided anything yet." Every word was deliberate. Every pause was a calculated beat to draw tension. Then I executed the first step. I left the envelope slightly protruding from the mailbox, ensuring it would catch Laura's eye when she came to retrieve her usual daily mail. I knew she would check early, like always, eager to assert control over the day. Predictably, within 30 minutes, she arrived, practically tiptoeing across the driveway with that sense of ownership she always carried. She opened the mailbox, and there it was. She didn't notice me watching from the kitchen window, but her reaction was everything I had hoped for. Her face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then closed. She lifted the envelope with trembling hands. I could see her heart racing just from the quick flick of her wrist, the hesitation before tearing it open. Inside were the documents, certified confirmation of the estate transfer, notarized and legally binding. Not only did it formalize ownership, but it also included clauses detailing that the house, accounts, and all associated assets were irrevocably under my control, with no power for any third party, including Michael or Laura, to interfere without my express, written consent. I didn't rush, I let her linger, reading each line with growing disbelief. Her hands shook, betraying the calculated composure she usually maintained. I stayed silent, savoring the exact moment her confidence cracked. "Mom, what, how?" her voice broke, almost whispering. I stepped out onto the porch, casually brushing imaginary crumbs from my sweater, letting the morning light fall across my face. "It's all very straightforward," I said, deliberately calm. "I've always kept my affairs in order. I suppose you just didn't expect me to enforce them." Her eyes darted toward Michael, who had pulled up in the driveway behind her. He had that familiar rigid posture, that half smile that wavered as he processed what was happening. I could see the panic building. Michael was finally realizing that their plan had backfired spectacularly. Laura's voice rose slightly, "But we were just trying to help. We were thinking about your safety." "Safety," I said slowly, each syllable deliberate, "has nothing to do with signing away my autonomy. And apparently you don't get to decide what I need. That part has always been my responsibility." I could see the gears turning in her mind. Her arrogance, her assumption that age equals weakness, was now glaringly exposed. She had underestimated my capacity to act decisively, to plan, and to execute. I took a step closer to the mailbox. "Everything you thought you could control, every decision you thought you could make on my behalf, has already been accounted for, legally, clearly, and irrevocably." Laura's hands clutched the edge of the envelope like it was a lifeline. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. Both of them were frozen in disbelief. I leaned slightly forward, my voice softening but growing colder. "You believed I was too old to live alone. You believed you could persuade me to surrender my home, my finances, my life, with nothing more than a brochure and a well-practiced tone. You were wrong. I watched as comprehension dawned on them, slow and brutal. This wasn't about emotion, pleading, or argument. This was law, logic, and preparation combined. They had no foothold. Every door they thought was open slammed shut. Every argument they had planned evaporated in the harsh light of reality. Laura finally managed a whisper, "But the house." "It's mine," I said firmly, my hands resting on the porch railing. "Everything in it and all associated accounts are mine. You have no access, no authority, and no legal claim. The documents in that envelope make it perfectly clear." Michael opened his mouth, likely to argue, but stopped mid-word. He realized as she did that every step they had taken was anticipated, every assumption accounted for. Their attempt to assert control had been dismantled with precision, using nothing more than patience, foresight, and careful planning. I let them stew for a moment longer. Silence can be crueler than words. I could see the realization set in fully, the depth of their miscalculation, the extent of their misjudgment, and the futility of any protest. Then I smiled, not in triumph, not out of malice, but because of the quiet satisfaction that comes when patience meets opportunity. "You wanted to handle things for me," I said softly, "but apparently I've handled them better myself." For the first time, I saw Laura's eyes well up, not just with frustration, but with the stark understanding that she had miscalculated in every possible way. Michael's expression was a mixture of shame and awe, the kind that comes when you realize someone you thought powerless has outmaneuvered you completely. And in that moment, the execution of my plan, the slow, deliberate orchestration of events, was complete. They weren't just defeated, they were exposed, humbled, and forced to witness the consequences of their arrogance firsthand. I had expected Laura's shock. I had expected Michael's hesitation. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the world outside our driveway would begin to play its part. That afternoon, while they lingered in stunned silence, the postman approached. He waved cheerfully at me from the curb, unaware of the tension that hung like smoke in the air. Laura, ever the perfectionist, had been fidgeting with the envelope, reading every clause again and again, muttering fragments under her breath. Michael's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, notifications piling up, but he didn't dare check it. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds," the postman said, setting a small stack of mail down. "Delivery for you." I nodded politely, accepting the letters, but my attention was drawn to a single envelope, bright white, embossed with a logo I recognized immediately, the local county tax assessor. I tore it open casually while Laura and Michael hovered, still reeling. Inside was a notice, the kind of notice nobody wants to receive, a delinquent property tax warning. But here's the twist: they had misread the timing. I had already prepaid the taxes in full weeks ago, and the notice was not only redundant but now documented publicly that my accounts were current, my obligations met. The county's system automatically flagged property in transition when they received changes in ownership. In other words, the estate transfer I had quietly processed triggered an official update that now bore my name in black and white. Laura's eyes widened. "Wait, this can't be right. The house, it's yours, officially." Michael's mouth opened again, but I interrupted gently. "Yes, legally, clearly, irrevocably. Everything in my name, everything under my control. You assumed I wouldn't anticipate the steps required. You were wrong." Their shock was compounded by a second, even more delicate twist. Earlier that week, I had quietly arranged for a discreet appraisal of the house. The results, which I kept in my handbag, revealed that its market value had skyrocketed due to recent zoning changes and the addition of new developments nearby. The house they believed they could pressure me into relinquishing was now not only untouchable legally, but worth more than they imagined. I placed the appraisal report on the table. Laura leaned in, her face paling as she scanned the figures. This is a fortune." I nodded calmly. "Exactly, and it remains entirely mine. Every suggestion you made about assisted living, every comment about my age, every plan to manage my affairs, redundant, ineffective, misguided." But here, where the first twist truly became irreversible, I had arranged a third-party notification. My attorney had discreetly sent letters to both Laura and Michael, confirming that any attempt to interfere with my estate or accounts would result in immediate legal action. This was not a threat, it was fact. Any action on their part, however small, would now carry consequences they hadn't anticipated. Laura's hands trembled. "But you didn't, we could have helped." I let my calm mask soften into a faint smile, the one I reserve for moments when patience and foresight converge perfectly. Helping is only valuable when it is asked for. You assumed I needed guidance. You assumed I couldn't manage. And now you understand the consequence of that assumption. Michael's expression twisted. He had always tried to mediate, to rationalize their plan as concern, but now he realized the structural flaw in their entire approach. They had underestimated me completely. Every step they had taken to assert authority was legally irrelevant. Every attempt at persuasion rendered moot. Every gesture meant to intimidate or manipulate, reversed. Laura sank into a chair, gripping the edge of the table, her eyes wide. You outmaneuvered us," she whispered. "Yes," I said softly, "and it wasn't luck, it wasn't reactionary, it was strategy, preparation, understanding the rules and following them better than you ever thought possible." The first twist, the unexpected complication in their carefully crafted plan, wasn't just that the law was on my side, it was that their arrogance had ensured it. They had played their cards openly, prematurely, and without checking the terrain. I had anticipated every move, every assumption, every overstep, and now they were trapped in the consequences of their own hubris. I leaned back, letting them absorb the weight of the revelation. Laura's voice cracked. Michael's jaw tightened. They realized the uncomfortable truth. Control is an illusion if wielded without understanding the foundations upon which it rests. I didn't need to add more. The first twist had done its work. The psychological edge was mine, and the stage for the next phase, where their assumptions would crumble completely, was set. By mid-afternoon, the shock had started to solidify into a tangible tension. Laura and Michael were still on my porch, both too stunned to leave and too embarrassed to speak freely. The kind of silence that had settled was heavy, almost suffocating, but I welcomed it. After decades of being underestimated, it was intoxicating to finally see them truly recognize the miscalculation they had made. I poured another cup of coffee, deliberately slow, letting the aroma fill the porch and punctuate the moment. They were fidgeting, Laura tapping her fingers on the envelope, Michael glancing repeatedly at his phone but not daring to make a call. The facade of control they had carried into my home had cracked completely. Then I spoke. "You assumed that I would comply, that I would defer to your judgment simply because I am older," I said, my voice measured, deliberate. "You believed that concern, or rather, the appearance of concern, would be sufficient to manipulate me into surrendering my home, my accounts, and my independence. You were wrong." Laura's mouth opened to protest, but I raised a hand gently, forcing her to stop. "Let me finish. This isn't about age or incapacity or even your intentions. This is about respect and understanding consequences." I could see the tension in Michael's jaw tighten. He had always tried to rationalize their actions as protective, but deep down he realized that their plan wasn't about protection, it was about control. The recognition of that fact hit them both like a punch. I stepped closer, casually placing the cup of coffee on the railing. "Do you see now? Every assumption you made about me, every thought that I would simply hand over my home and finances, was flawed, not because you're incapable of planning, but because you underestimated my resolve." Laura's eyes were wide, her hands gripping the edges of the brochure like it was a lifeline. "But we were just trying to help her," she whispered, almost pleading. I smiled faintly. "Help is only meaningful when it is requested. You tried to impose guidance under the guise of concern. That's not help, that's overreach, and overreach comes with consequences." At this moment, the turning point crystallized. Their belief in their own moral authority, the assumption that their concern justified their intrusion, was fully dismantled. They realized that their arrogance had handed me the leverage I needed to completely neutralize them. I moved to the mailbox and pulled out a small stack of letters, holding them casually. "These," I said, "are all notifications related to the estate transfer, all legally binding. Every step taken, every decision made in your absence, is now formalized and irreversible." Laura's breathing quickened. You handled all of this without telling us." "Of course," I replied. "I've lived here for decades. I've learned how to anticipate moves, understand the rules, and prepare for contingencies. You assumed I wouldn't notice, let alone act, and yet here we are." Michael ran a hand through his hair, finally speaking. "Mom, we didn't realize, we thought we were helping." I let the words hang, a sharp reminder that their intentions didn't erase their misjudgment. Helping requires consent. You assumed it was given. That was your error, and now you are witnessing the consequences. At that moment, the turning point became fully visible, not just to them, but to me. The house, the accounts, the estate, they were mine, untouchable, and protected by every legal mechanism I could employ. Every tactic they thought would manipulate me had been anticipated and countered. The psychological edge had shifted completely. No longer was I defending my independence. I was asserting it, demonstrating control, and forcing them to acknowledge their complete miscalculation. Laura's voice cracked. We didn't know." Michael nodded, silent but defeated. Their plan, which had seemed so carefully orchestrated in their minds, had unraveled entirely. The turning point was not violent, not loud, not dramatic. It was the quiet, devastating realization that their assumption of authority was both incorrect and irrevocably irrelevant. I leaned back on the porch railing, letting them absorb the weight of their misjudgment. The air was thick with tension, embarrassment, and a hint of fear, not of me personally, but of the consequences they had triggered by assuming they could act without full knowledge or consent. For the first time, they understood something fundamental. Underestimating me had been their critical error. Every move they made to control me now served only to expose their own vulnerability and arrogance. And in that quiet acknowledgement, I knew that the final act, the one that would seal their complete undoing, was approaching. The stage was fully set, and the payoff was inevitable. Just when Laura and Michael began to settle into the crushing weight of their realization, the second twist arrived, a complication they couldn't have anticipated, not in their wildest strategizing. It came by email first, a simple notification from the local Historical Preservation Society. The house, it turned out, had been nominated for heritage recognition decades ago, something Daniel had quietly filed to protect its legacy. The documentation had been sitting in municipal archives, unnoticed, until a routine review triggered a formal acknowledgement. Within days, the house was not just legally mine, it was now designated as a protected historic property. I casually slid the email onto the kitchen counter as they hovered nearby, still reeling from the morning's revelations. Historic, Laura repeated, disbelief tinging her voice. What does that mean? I smiled faintly. It means the house cannot be sold, subdivided, or altered in any way that conflicts with its designation. Your plans to handle it, to take control, to profit, completely irrelevant now. Irrevocably protected under state law. You have no legal leverage, no path forward. Michael's face went pale. He muttered something under his breath about value and control, but I ignored him. His words were empty now. Empty because their assumptions had collided with two unyielding forces, law and foresight. And then the subtle, even cruel twist emerged. I had quietly arranged for a private title search months ago, anticipating their push for assisted living. That search revealed not only the protective clauses in the trust, but also a stipulation Daniel had inserted long ago, one they had never been aware of. Any attempt by a direct heir or spouse to influence the disposition of the property without my consent triggered immediate legal fees and third-party oversight, enforceable at my discretion. In other words, every action Laura and Michael had taken, every visit, every push for assisted living, every suggestion of help, had technically put them in breach of an agreement they weren't even aware existed. Not criminal, no, but enforceable and binding in civil terms. It was the perfect reversal. Laura's hands shook, gripping the edges of the counter. We didn't know, she stammered. We thought we were helping, I finished for her. Yes, and that assumption, however innocent in your mind, has consequences you didn't foresee. Michael's jaw tightened. He glanced at Laura, as if seeking an anchor, but she had none. Both of them were trapped in a web of legal and psychological precision that I had constructed quietly, patiently, over the past week. I let the moment linger. Silence in this case was sharper than any words. I watched them absorb the implications. Their attempts to manipulate were not only futile but now potentially costly, humiliating, and utterly transparent. And then, the final layer of the twist revealed itself. I had taken the precaution of notifying my attorney of all their recent behaviors, coupled with a notarized statement detailing their overreach. Should they attempt to pursue any legal maneuver to challenge my autonomy or control, they would find themselves on the defensive, facing both the law and meticulously documented evidence of their miscalculations. Laura's voice broke completely. We never meant to. You assumed, I interrupted softly, and assumptions are dangerous when they meet foresight. Your miscalculation wasn't accidental, it was fundamental. You thought you controlled the situation, but every step you took only tightened the net around yourselves. Michael sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair, silent at last. Laura buried her face in her hands. Both of them were experiencing a cognitive collapse. The shock of realizing their arrogance had led them straight into a situation they could neither reverse nor escape without consequences. I stood calmly, the second twist fully executed. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through the layered application of law, documentation, and patience. They had assumed weakness, sought to exploit it, and found themselves ensnared instead. This was the moment where the reversal became undeniable. They had no power, no leverage, no recourse. Every advantage they imagined they had was illusory. The house, the accounts, the independence they sought to undermine, they were mine, fully protected and untouchable. I allowed myself a faint smile as they sat there, speechless, their plans unraveled not by emotion or luck, but by the deliberate orchestration of every detail they had overlooked. This was poetic justice, not loud, not messy, but precise, undeniable, and irreversible. And as they sat in stunned silence, I knew the final act, the ultimate reversal, was ready to unfold. The fallout would be complete and the lesson permanent. By the following morning, the psychological shift was complete. Laura and Michael had retreated into a quiet corner of the house, no longer projecting authority but simmering in disbelief and humiliation. Every calculated move they had made, every attempt to help me, had been rendered irrelevant. The power dynamic had inverted entirely. I was no longer defending my home. I was asserting an unmistakable dominance that was both legal and personal. I started the day with deliberate calm. I didn't rush them, didn't lecture, didn't gloat overtly. I allowed the environment to do the work for me. The house was quiet except for the subtle sounds of birds outside, the distant hum of traffic, and the soft rustle of papers from the envelope they had discovered the previous day. Every element reinforced my control. First, I addressed the immediate financial implications. The estate transfer and the historic designation had triggered a formal notification with the local county. It was public record now. The house, the land, the accounts, everything was legally tied to me. Any action they tried to take to interfere, even with the best intentions, would now require legal counsel, oversight, and potentially financial liability. The weight of this reality fell on them like a physical force. Laura was the first to break. She tried to protest the historic designation, muttering something about restrictions and planning, but I shook my head gently. You can't plan for what you don't control. The law is clear, and my authority here is absolute. Michael, who had previously attempted to mediate or rationalize their behavior, finally spoke with a voice subdued and almost fearful. We didn't understand. No, I said, cutting softly but firmly. You didn't understand because you assumed weakness where there was none. You didn't anticipate patience, foresight, or preparedness, and assumptions, as you've now learned, are dangerous. Next, I orchestrated the social dimension of the fallout. I made casual calls to neighbors and the local HOA, mentioning in passing that the property was fully my responsibility, and that any discussions regarding assistance should be cleared with me first. By the time Laura and Michael realized it, the narrative in the community had shifted subtly, but completely. Their attempts to appear concerned or helpful now looked controlling and intrusive in the eyes of outsiders. Then came the legal reinforcement. I followed up with my attorney, requesting confirmation letters be sent to both of them. Any attempt to influence the estate or accounts would be treated as interference and potentially actionable. They received the letters mid-afternoon. Michael's hand trembled as he read the formal language. Laura's face was ashen, her composure shattered. Every potential leverage point they had imagined was legally neutralized. The house itself became a symbol of the reversal. The historic designation ensured that not only could they not take control, but the property was now insulated from any future attempts to manipulate or exploit it. The garden, the porch, the mailbox, they were all mine, protected, untouchable, and a daily, living reminder of their failure. By the end of the day, Laura and Michael had retreated to the edge of the property, silent, defeated, and humiliated. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by grudging acceptance. I had not only protected what was mine, but had done so in a way that exposed their overreach, leaving them powerless witnesses to their own misjudgment. The final irony of the reversal was in their interactions with each other. Laura, usually dominant, was visibly shaken and hesitant to speak, while Michael, who had tried to mediate, seemed unsure how to assert himself without triggering further consequences. Their coordinated strategy had dissolved entirely under the weight of meticulous planning, legal leverage, and my patient execution. By evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset filter through the trees. The quiet was no longer tense or precarious. It was celebratory, a reaffirmation of independence won and control fully reasserted. Laura and Michael had learned the hard way that assumptions about weakness, arrogance disguised as concern, and overreach are not trivial. They can unravel completely when met with patience, preparation, and precision. The fallout was reversed. The power they had tried to seize had been methodically stripped away. I was no longer at risk of manipulation or interference. Instead, I held every advantage, legal, psychological, and symbolic. The house was mine, the accounts were mine, my independence was absolute, and the lesson that underestimating me would have consequences was permanently imprinted in their consciousness. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to lean back, exhaling slowly. Everything was in its place. Every consequence had been delivered with quiet precision, every expectation they had assumed dismantled without confrontation, every miscalculation exposed. Laura and Michael had entered my home believing they were the architects of my future. Instead, They had become witnesses to the methodical, undeniable reclamation of control by the person they sought to manipulate. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle. I didn't need to gloat. They would never forget. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that wasn't forced or fragile but full of certainty. Laura and Michael had retreated to their respective corners of awareness, humbled, broken of assumptions, and utterly aware that the battlefield they had attempted to dominate belonged entirely to me. I wandered through the rooms slowly, touching the surfaces I had maintained for decades. Every door, every windowsill, every creaking step in the old floorboards whispered continuity, resilience, and victory. The envelope in my hand, the estate transfer, had long since served its purpose. It wasn't just a legal document, it had been a weapon, a mirror reflecting their arrogance, a demonstration of the cost of misjudgment. I paused at the living room window and looked outside. The garden was serene, sunlight streaking across the lawn, shadows shifting over the pathway. I could see Laura packing lightly near the driveway, and Michael standing stiffly, phone forgotten at his side. Both were trapped in the comprehension of what they had lost before they ever realized what they had assumed they would gain. I smiled faintly, a smile not born of cruelty but of quiet satisfaction. It was the kind of satisfaction that comes from being underestimated, and yet seeing every miscalculation unravel exactly as predicted. The irony of it, the subtlety of the reversal, the poetic timing of the entire orchestration, it was flawless. I sipped my coffee one last time and let the air settle around me. No shouting, no confrontation, no bitterness, just the recognition of inevitability, the slow, steady, inescapable consequence of hubris. And then I said it softly to no one but myself, letting the words hang in the sunlight, sharp and precise. You should have minded your own business. It was over. And in that simple sentence lay the full measure of justice, quiet, clever, and irrevocable,